This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of human origins. For decades, we followed a simple story of a single African cradle. But today, groundbreaking science is rewriting that narrative. In this narration, we'll dive into the essential revisions to the out-of-Africa model, moving beyond linear paths to uncover a braided river of humanity. We'll explore mysterious fossils, ancient interbreeding, and the forgotten pioneers who shaped our species. Join us as we journey through 1,000,000 years of history to discover the complex global reality of where we truly came from. The Middle Pleistocene is a period that has long been described by specialists as a murky interval in our history. Spanning roughly from 800,000 to 300,000 years ago, this era marks the transition between the early appearance of ancestors like Homo erectus and the eventual rise of recognizable modern humans. For a century, this long stretch of time was a source of constant frustration, filled with fragmentary fossils and population histories that seemed too entangled to unravel. It became known as the Muddle in the Middle, a place where evolutionary boundaries were blurred and geographic sampling was uneven. However, recent discoveries and a dramatic reassessment of existing fossils are beginning to provide a much clearer shape to this period, particularly through evidence emerging from East Asia. At the heart of this new understanding are the fossils recovered from a site along the Han River in central China, a tributary of the Yangtze in Hubei province. This location has yielded 3 significant hominin crania found across several decades. The first was unearthed in 1989, followed by a second in 1990, and a third as recently as 2022. These specimens, often referred to as the Yunxian fossils, have been dated using paleomagnetic and biostratigraphic techniques to between 940,000 and 1.1 million years old. This makes them some of the oldest and most complete human skulls ever recovered from this specific era. For a long time, their true identity remained a mystery. Because they were recovered in a badly distorted state, one was severely crushed and another suffered significant deformation, they were difficult to classify. Over the decades, researchers tentatively assigned them to various groups, including Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, while others simply used the vague label of archaic Homo sapiens. The breakthrough came with the application of modern imaging technology. Using high-resolution CT scanning and structured light imaging, researchers were able to digitally reconstruct the original 3-dimensional form of these skulls. When the second Yunxian cranium was restored, the results were startling. While the skull remained long and low, a feature typically associated with earlier human ancestors, its internal volume told a different story. The brain size was estimated at roughly 1,143 cubic centimeters. This is remarkably large for a specimen that is over 1,000,000 years old. It suggested that even at this incredibly early stage, human ancestors in East Asia were developing cognitive capacities that were far more advanced than previously assumed. The anatomy of these reconstructed skulls revealed a mosaic of traits that didn't fit into any single known category. The face and the back of the head displayed a blend of primitive characteristics and more derived modern-looking features. Some of these aspects aligned with other East Asian fossils, such as the famous Harbin cranium, which is often linked to the Denisovans. Other features, however, appeared to resemble traits seen in much later modern humans. This mixture of characteristics is exactly what created the confusion of the muddle in the middle, but it is now being seen as a vital clue to a much larger story. Sophisticated phylogenetic analyses have now placed these Chinese fossils into a specific grouping known as the Homo longi clade. This group likely includes the Denisovans and several other ancient fossils of a similar age found across China. Most significantly, these specimens appear to have a very close relationship with another ancient species found in Europe, known as Homo antecessor, which has been recovered from sites in Spain. Together, these groups from China and Spain appear to form a sister group to the lineage that eventually produced modern humans. The implications of this relationship are profound. If these groups from opposite ends of Eurasia are so closely linked, it suggests that the deepest roots of our species might not be exclusive to Africa. Instead, it points toward a common stem population that may have existed across Eurasia more than 1 million years ago. This challenges the traditional view that East Asia was a peripheral backwater where evolution moved slowly. Instead, it frames the region as a central arena where major human lineages were already diverging and developing complex traits long before the final expansion of modern humans. This reassessment helps to bring order to the chaos of the Middle Pleistocene. Rather than a simple, linear ladder of progress, our history is being reimagined as a branching bush with many stems growing simultaneously. Experts now propose that most of the large-brained humans from the last 800,000 years can be grouped into 5 major lineages. These include the Asian Homo erectus, the European Neanderthals, the mysterious Denisovans of Asia, our own species Homo sapiens, and a group known as Homo heidelbergensis. These groups did not exist in isolation. They diverged early, coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years, and frequently interacted. In this updated framework, some fossils that were once thought to be our direct ancestors are being moved to side branches. For example, classic specimens found in Zambia and Greece, often labeled as Homo heidelbergensis, now appear to belong to a lineage that split off as early as 1.5 million years ago. They may have been a side branch that eventually went extinct rather than the direct ancestors of Neanderthals or modern humans. This realization changes how we view the fossils that populate the middle of our evolutionary timeline. It suggests that many different types of humans were experimenting with larger brains and complex behaviors at the same time across different continents. The Yangtze fossils act as an anchor for this pivotal moment around 1 million years ago. They represent a time when multiple lineages were migrating, diverging, and perhaps even interbreeding across the vast landscapes of Africa and Eurasia. The fact that these skulls show such advanced traits at such an early date suggests that the evolutionary processes that eventually produced modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were already well underway much earlier than the traditional out-of-Africa model allowed for. The traditional narrative often assumed that Homo erectus was a relatively static species that lived for a long time without much change before being replaced. But the new evidence from China suggests that there was much more diversity and change occurring within these early populations. Some of them were clearly moving toward the more modern forms we see later in the fossil record. This blurring of morphological boundaries is likely the result of hybridization. Just as ancient DNA has proven that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred much later in history, it is becoming increasingly likely that similar events were occurring 1 million years ago. This would explain why so many fossils from the Middle Pleistocene show such puzzling combinations of traits. The story that is emerging is one of a braided river of ancient populations. These groups were flowing across continents, sometimes separating and sometimes merging back together. This process was happening long before the final global expansion of our species. The Yangtze fossils provide perhaps the clearest window yet into these complex evolutionary processes. They show that the roots of humanity are spread wide across the globe, and that the transition from our earliest ancestors to modern humans was not a single event in a single place, but a long, interconnected journey that spanned the entire Old World. As researchers continue to analyze these million-year-old remains and compare them with other finds from around the world, the outlines of the Middle Pleistocene are becoming clearer. The muddled was beginning to take shape, revealing a history that is much older and much more Eurasian than we once believed. This new perspective doesn't just change the dates on a timeline. It changes our fundamental understanding of how different human groups relate to one another. It suggests that the traits we consider uniquely human were being forged in many places at once, through a constant exchange of genes and ideas across vast distances. The discovery and reconstruction of these ancient skulls have opened a door to a new way of thinking about our origins. They suggest that the expansion of the human brain and the refinement of the human face were not restricted to one corner of the world. Instead, these changes were part of a global phenomenon that saw different lineages rising and falling, sometimes leaving their mark on the populations that followed and sometimes disappearing into the shadows of history. The Yangtzean fossils stand as a testament to this complex, million-year-old struggle for survival and adaptation, providing a vital link in the chain that connects our earliest ancestors to the world we inhabit today. While the traditional model emphasized a single point of origin, the Eurasian challenge suggests that we must look at the entire landscape of the Old World to truly understand where we came from. The sister group relationship between the fossils of China and Spain indicates that a highly successful and widely dispersed population was already thriving across Eurasia long before the date usually given for the emergence of modern human traits. This population was not just surviving, it was evolving rapidly, developing the large brains and complex social structures that would eventually define our species and our close relatives. This shift in perspective also forces a re-evaluation of the African record. If significant diversification was happening in Eurasia 1,000,000 years ago, it means that the later phases of evolution that occurred in Africa were part of a much larger, more interactive global system. Africa was not an isolated cradle, but part of a continuous network of populations that were constantly moving and shifting in response to changing climates and environments. The muddle in the middle was not a period of stagnation, but a time of intense evolutionary activity that laid the groundwork for everything that was to come. The technological ability to see through the damage of time and restore these fossils to their original state has been a game changer. It has allowed us to see the faces of our ancestors as they truly were, rather than as the distorted fragments we once found in the earth. These faces tell a story of a species in transition, caught between the primitive world of the early Pleistocene and the modern world that was beginning to emerge. They remind us that our history is not written in a straight line, but in a complex web of connections that stretches back more than 1,000,000 years. The 5 major lineages now recognized, Asian Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, represent the branches of this ancient bush. Each of these groups contributed to the story of human evolution, and each of them likely carried the potential for the traits we see in ourselves today. The Jungian fossils, with their remarkably large brains and mosaic features, are a key part of this branching history. They show that the drive toward larger brains and more complex forms was a widespread trend, occurring in multiple lineages across different continents. As we look closer at this 1,000,000-year-old challenge, the boundaries between these lineages become even more fluid. The evidence of Chapter 2: The Network of Our Origins. For decades, the story of our origins was told as a focused, almost linear narrative. We were taught to look for a single point on the map, a specific Garden of Eden, where the first modern humans took their initial steps. This traditional out-of-Africa model suggested that anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerged in a small, isolated region, most likely in East Africa's Rift Valley, or perhaps the lush tip of South Africa, roughly 200,000 years ago. From this singular cradle, a small group supposedly grew, perfected its technology, and eventually replaced all other human types across the continent and the world. It was a tidy, easy-to-understand story, but as our ability to peer into the past through both fossils and genetics has advanced, that tidy story has begun to unravel. In its place, a far more complex and dynamic picture is emerging. A model that envisions our species not as the product of one lucky group in one specific place, but as the result of a massive, continent-wide, structured African metapopulation. The Jebel Irhoud fossils revealed something even more fascinating about how we evolved. The individuals found there weren't perfect modern humans. Instead, they displayed a mosaic of features. Their faces were remarkably modern. If you saw one of them on a crowded street today, they might not stand out. They possessed the delicate facial structure and small brow ridges that characterize people today, along with one of the most uniquely derived features of our species, the complex inverted T-shape of the chin. But the back of their heads told a different story. Their brain cases were elongated and more primitive, lacking the high, globular shape that characterizes people today. This suggests that the different parts of our anatomy didn't all evolve at once in a single package. Instead, our modern face appeared early, while the rounded shape of our brain case and potentially the internal organization of our brains took much longer to develop. This mosaic evolution wasn't just happening in Morocco. Across the continent, other fossils were telling similar stories of regional diversity. In Ethiopia, at the site of Omo Kibish, researchers found remains that are now dated to about 233,000 years ago. These individuals looked different from the ones in Morocco. They had more rounded brain cases, but remained quite robust. Further south, at a site called Florisbad in South Africa, a partial skull dating to about 259,000 years ago showed yet another combination of traits. What we are seeing is a fragmented continental trend toward the modern human form. Instead of a single population evolving in one spot, different groups across Africa were developing different modern traits at different times. To understand how these scattered groups eventually became a single species, we have to look at the environment they inhabited. Africa is a vast continent with incredibly diverse landscapes, from dense tropical forests and expansive savannas to harsh, arid deserts. Throughout the Middle Pleistocene, the African climate was far from stable. It went through massive cycles of change, driven by global shifts in temperature and moisture. One of the most dramatic examples of this is the Green Sahara periods. At certain times, increased rainfall transformed the Sahara Desert into a lush landscape of lakes, rivers, and grasslands. During these windows, the desert was no longer a barrier. It was a corridor that allowed human groups to move freely between North, West, and East Africa. However, when the climate shifted back toward aridity, these corridors closed. Habitats became fractured, and human populations were forced into isolated refugia, pockets of habitable land where they could survive the harsh conditions. In these periods of isolation, these groups would adapt to their local environments, developing unique physical traits and cultural practices. Then, when the rains returned and the barriers fell, these once isolated groups would expand their ranges, meet, and exchange genes and ideas. This constant process of fission and fusion, of populations splitting apart and merging back together, acted like an evolutionary engine. It allowed for a diverse range of traits to emerge in different places and then be shared across the continent. This structured African metapopulation is supported by powerful new genetic evidence. A sweeping analysis of DNA from modern African populations has challenged the idea of a clean, single-origin family tree. One particularly important study, led by Brenna Henn of UC Davis, focused on the Nama people of southern Africa, a group known for their immense genetic diversity. To ground this high-tech genomic modeling in human reality, researchers spent years between 2012 and 2015 traveling to remote villages to collect saliva samples from Nama individuals. By comparing these genomes with those of other groups across the continent and using sophisticated computer modeling, researchers found that the evidence does not support a single ancestral population. Instead, the best-fitting model is what experts call a weakly structured stem. According to this model, the roots of modern humans were composed of two or more populations that had been diverging for hundreds of thousands of years, but never completely lost contact. These groups continued to exchange genes even as they developed regional differences. The earliest detectable split between these ancient populations that still leaves a mark in our DNA today happened roughly 120,000 to 135,000 years ago. But even after this split, the groups remained connected. This means that we don't have a single mitochondrial Eve in the sense of one woman in one place being our only ancestor. Instead, our genetic heritage is a composite drawn from a network of populations spread across the vast African landscape. The behavioral record also supports this polycentric or many-centered view of our origins. For a long time, archaeologists looked for a creative explosion, the moment when modern behavior like art, complex toolmaking, and symbolic thought first appeared. They expected to find it in one place at one time. But the Middle Stone Age record shows that sophisticated technologies were popping up all over Africa in a mosaic fashion. We see the use of color pigments and symbolic engravings at Blombo's cave in South Africa, while the crafting of delicate obsidian tools appears at Nkapuni-ya-Muto in Kenya. These innovations weren't the product of a single genius group. They were being developed independently or shared through the vast social networks that linked these far-flung populations. This interconnectedness fostered a broad ecological adaptation that would eventually allow our species to thrive in nearly every environment on Earth. The traditional view of a single origin point in East or South Africa was largely based on where the most fossils had been found. Because the conditions in the East African Rift and the caves of South Africa are excellent for preserving bone, those regions dominated our understanding of the past. But the discovery at Jebel Irhoud reminds us that there are huge parts of the continent, particularly West and Central Africa, where the fossil record is almost non-existent due to the acidic soils of the tropical forests. The metapopulation model acknowledges these gaps, suggesting that our history was likely unfolding in these hidden regions just as much as in the famous fossil finding sites. Genetic studies have also revealed a major east-to-west migration within Africa that happened before humans ever left the continent. This massive movement of people reshaped the ancestry of West African groups, increasing the genetic affinity between people across the continent. This turnover shows that the African landscape was a place of constant movement and replacement long before the global expansion of our species. It reinforces the idea that Africa was not a static cradle, but a dynamic arena of shifting populations. This revised picture of our origins has profound implications for how we define ourselves as a species. We are the product of a continent-wide network born of environmental instability, where the modern human form emerged as a slow, piecemeal process of coalescence rather than a sudden finished product. The mega-droughts and climate fluctuations of the Pleistocene didn't just challenge our ancestors, they shaped them, forcing the development of social structures that could maintain connections over long distances and cognitive abilities that could solve the problems of new and difficult environments. As this continental network continued to pulse with the rhythm of the changing climate, it did more than just mix modern human genes. It also brought our ancestors into contact with the lingering shadows of much older lineages, leading to encounters that would leave a permanent, ghostly mark on our genetic code. Chapter 3: The Leaky Replacement and the Genetic Ghosts of Our Past. For a generation, the dominant view of human origins was one of absolute replacement. The narrative was simple and somewhat brutal. A new, superior species of human emerged in Africa, developed advanced tools and language, and then swept across the globe like a rising tide. In this version of history, the archaic humans who already lived in Europe and Asia, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and others, simply vanished. They were seen as evolutionary dead ends, pushed into extinction by our ancestors with little to no interaction. This was the pure out-of-Africa model, often supported by early studies of mitochondrial DNA, which seemed to show a clean break between us and them. But as our ability to sequence the entire human genome has advanced, this story of total replacement has given way to a much messier, more fascinating reality known as leaky replacement. This shift began when scientists moved beyond looking at just a single strand of DNA passed down from mothers and started looking at the billions of base pairs that make up our entire genetic code. The breakthrough came with the realization that the DNA of living people contains a biological archive of every encounter our ancestors ever had. When the genomes of archaic humans were finally sequenced, the results were a revelation. It turned out that nearly everyone living outside of Africa today carries a small but significant legacy of the Neanderthals, roughly 2 to 3% of their DNA. This wasn't a case of total replacement, it was a case of assimilation. Our ancestors didn't just walk past the Neanderthals, they lived with them, mated with them, and incorporated their genetic heritage into our own. The discovery of this leaky boundary between species didn't stop with the Neanderthals. In the remote mountains of Siberia, a single finger bone and a few large teeth yielded a genome from a group that was neither modern human nor Neanderthals. These were the Denisovans, a mysterious population that lived across Asia. When their DNA was compared to modern populations, another surprise emerged. While Europeans have almost no Denisovan ancestry, populations in Oceania, particularly in New Guinea and Australia, carry a double dose of archaic DNA. They have the standard Neanderthal signature, but they also carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA. This means that as modern humans traveled along the southern coasts of Asia, they encountered and interbred with a second group of archaic cousins who were already well established in the region. This evidence of interbreeding has forced a complete rethink of the taxonomic divisions established in earlier chapters. If modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans were separate enough to look different but similar enough to produce fertile offspring, the lines we draw on our evolutionary trees become much more porous. As discussed in Chapter 1, the 5 major human lineages, Asian Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, and Homo heidelbergensis, are better understood as regional nodes in a vast interconnected network. This shift in perspective suggests that for hundreds of thousands of years, different human groups were diverging and then merging back together, exchanging genes that help them adapt to new environments. One of the most compelling aspects of this leaky replacement is that the archaic genes we carry aren't just random leftovers. Many of them appear to have been preserved by natural selection because they provided a survival advantage, a process known as adaptive introgression. For example, certain immune system genes known as HLA alleles, which help the body recognize and fight off local pathogens, show strong evidence of being inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans. In some modern European and Asian populations, more than half of these critical immune genes come from archaic sources. Our ancestors, arriving in new and unfamiliar lands, essentially borrowed the immune systems that archaic humans had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting in those environments. A particularly striking example of this borrowed adaptation is the EPAS1 gene. This specific genetic variant allows the human body to function efficiently at extremely high altitudes where oxygen levels are low. While this variant is almost non-existent in most of the world, it is found in nearly all native Tibetans. Genetic sequencing has revealed that this life-saving adaptation was inherited directly from Denisovans. Similarly, patterns have been found in genes related to skin color and hair texture. As modern humans moved into the colder, less sunny regions of the north, they picked up genetic variants from Neanderthals that helped produce lighter skin or different hair types, traits that were advantageous for vitamin D production in low-light environments. The leaky nature of our past extends much further back than the era of Neanderthals. A groundbreaking 2026 study in paleoproteomics provided a window into this deep history by sequencing proteins from 400,000-year-old Homo erectus dental enamel found in China. The analysis revealed a specific amino acid variant that was previously thought to be unique to later lineages. This same variant is shared between those ancient Homo erectus populations, the Denisovans, and eventually Homo sapiens. This discovery provides the first direct evidence that the boundaries between the oldest human lineages were just as porous as those of the later Pleistocene. It suggests that the modern human we see today is actually a genetic mosaic, a composite being built from successful adaptations that have been circulating through the human network for nearly 500,000 years. But perhaps the most startling revelation in recent years is that this process of interbreeding wasn't restricted to the world outside of Africa. For a long time, it was assumed that sub-Saharan African populations represented a pure modern human lineage because they didn't carry Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. However, sophisticated statistical modeling and whole genome analysis have revealed that Africa has its own ghosts. Researchers have uncovered traces of ancestry from as-yet unidentified archaic populations in the genomes of modern West African groups like the Yoruba and the Mende. These ghost lineages are populations that we know existed because of the unique genetic signatures they left behind, even though we haven't found their fossils yet. In some West African populations, as much as 19% of their genome appears to come from an archaic group that diverged from the modern human lineage hundreds of thousands of years before the Neanderthals did. This means that the African continent was just as much of a melting pot as Eurasia. While some groups were developing the physical traits we associate with modern humans, they were living alongside and interbreeding with more ancient lineages that had survived in different pockets of the continent. A specific example of this deep genetic legacy can be found in a protein called mucin 7, which is found in human saliva. Mucin 7 plays a critical role in our health by binding to pathogens and helping to clear them from the mouth, providing a frontline defense against infection. When scientists analyzed the gene responsible for this protein, they found a version of it in some African populations that is so different from the version found in the rest of the world that it must have come from an interbreeding event with a very ancient archaic group. The coalescence time, the point where this version of the gene shares a common ancestor with our own, reaches back 4.5 million years. This suggests our ancestors were picking up genetic material from lineages that had been separate for millions of years, further strengthening their biological resilience. While many of these ghosts are currently known only through DNA, we are beginning to find physical evidence that matches the genetic predictions. In Nigeria, a fossil found at a site called Iwo Eleru has provided a tangible link to these lingering archaic groups. Though the fossil is only about 13,000 years old, dating to a time when humans were already beginning to experiment with agriculture in other parts of the world, its physical features look remarkably primitive, resembling skulls that are over 100,000 years old. Iwo Eleru represents a physical ghost, a remnant of an archaic population that survived in West Africa much longer than previously thought, likely interbreeding with the modern human populations that eventually surrounded them. The discovery of these ghost lineages has been made possible by new tools in computational biology, specifically a method known as approximate Bayesian computation with deep learning scheme, or ABCDLS. These neural networks and deep learning algorithms can scan thousands of modern genomes and identify patterns that don't fit the standard model of human descent. They can detect admixture events, moments in the past where two different populations met and merged. These models reinforce the idea that human history is a complex, braided network rather than a linear path. This complexity helps explain why the fossil record is so difficult to categorize. When we find specimens like those from Jebel Irhoud, which display a modern face alongside a primitive brain case, we aren't necessarily looking at a transitional species in the traditional sense. We might be looking at a hybrid. Morphology, the shape of bones, can be deceptive when populations are frequently interbreeding and blurring the boundaries between types. The physical diversity we see in the past is the manifestation of this constant genetic exchange. One of the big questions remaining is why, if interbreeding was so common, we don't see more archaic DNA in our genomes today. If we met and mated with Neanderthals for thousands of years, why is their contribution only 2 or 3%? The answer likely lies in a combination of genetic drift and selection. In some cases, the hybrid offspring may have had lower fertility, a phenomenon seen in many closely related species today. Over many generations, the archaic versions of certain genes might have been weeded out by natural selection if they were less compatible with the modern human genetic background. However, there is another fascinating possibility: mitochondrial exclusion. Mitochondrial DNA is only passed down through the mother, and it represents only a tiny fraction of our total genetic material. If the interbreeding events were skewed, for example, if it was primarily modern human women and archaic men who had children, the archaic mitochondrial line would never be passed on, even if the archaic nuclear DNA was incorporated into the population. This would explain why our mitochondrial Eve still looks purely African and relatively recent, while our nuclear DNA tells a story of much older, more diverse origins. The Leaky replacement model also changes how we view the extinction of other humans. Instead of a violent or competitive replacement where one group killed off another, it suggests a process of absorption. The Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't necessarily fail in the evolutionary sense. They were simply folded into the much larger and more rapidly expanding population of modern humans. Their physical forms vanished as distinct entities, but their genetic legacy lives on in us. They are not gone. They are a part of who we are. This perspective is also reshaping our understanding of the timing of human movements. Genetic evidence now suggests that some of these interbreeding events happened much earlier than the main expansion 50,000 years ago. For instance, traces of modern human-like DNA have been found in the genomes of Neanderthals living in the Altai Mountains of Siberia as far back as 100,000 years ago. This means that even the earliest movements out of Africa were leaky, with genetic material flowing into archaic populations long before those same archaic groups contributed DNA back to the final wave of modern human migrants. The ancient encounters of the Pleistocene are still influencing the biology of modern humans in the 21st century. Because different populations inherited different sets of genes from archaic humans, they may have different vulnerabilities or resistances to certain diseases. Researchers are now looking at how Neanderthal-derived genes affect everything from blood clotting and skin conditions to the way our bodies respond to viral infections. As we look deeper into our DNA, the map of our origins continues to expand. We are seeing a world that was once populated by a diverse array of human types, all of whom were more interconnected than we ever imagined. The realization that we are a composite species, the survivors of a long history of migration, encounter, and recombination, turns our attention back to the mechanics of these movements. If our ancestors were constantly meeting and merging with other groups, what was it about the final wave of expansion that allowed it to eventually dominate the globe? To answer that, we must look beyond the genes themselves and toward the specific environmental and social pressures that turned a network of interconnected populations into a single global species. Chapter 4: The Master Generalists and the Ghostly Footprints of Failure. For a long time, the history of human migration was viewed as a singular, triumphant event. We imagined a small group of modern humans finally cracking the code of survival, crossing the borders of Africa roughly 60,000 years ago and spreading across the globe in a single, unstoppable wave. This narrative suggested that before this moment, our ancestors were essentially trapped within their home continent, waiting for a technological or cognitive breakthrough. However, the more we dig into the caves of the Levant, the forests of Europe, and the river valleys of China, the more we realize that the truth is far more haunting. Our history is littered with the footprints of failed pioneers, groups of modern humans who left Africa tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years before the successful wave, only to vanish into the shadows of time. The evidence for these early, forgotten treks is becoming impossible to ignore. In the Apodema cave in Greece, researchers identified a skull fragment belonging to a modern human that dates back 210,000 years. In the millennia cave in Israel, a jawbone with modern teeth was found in layers dating back to roughly 180,000 years ago. We see evidence of modern humans in the Shkul and Kafsa caves of the Levant between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago, and modern human teeth in southern China at sites like Daoxuan and Girondin of a similar age. Perhaps most surprising is that these failures continued even after the primary wave of expansion had begun. Recent discoveries at sites like Ranis in Germany and Zlatý Kun in the Czech Republic reveal that early Homo sapiens entered Europe around 45,000 years ago. Despite their advanced tools and ability to navigate cold environments, these groups left no lasting genetic legacy in modern Europeans. They were replaced by later populations, representing a late failure of dispersal that occurred even as our species was ostensibly conquering the world. These people successfully navigated the exit from Africa, but ultimately hit an evolutionary end. They were the failed pioneers, groups that either died out entirely or were forced to retreat, leaving the world to be resettled by later, more resilient waves. To understand why these early migrations failed while the later ones succeeded, we have to look at the relationship between human behavior and the shifting climate of the Pleistocene. For much of our history, the path out of Africa was governed by climatic windows. The primary route into Eurasia was the northern route, through the Nile Valley and across the Sinai Peninsula. This region, the Levantine Corridor, acted as a gate. During periods of increased rainfall, the Saharo-Arabian desert belt would green up, creating lush corridors of grasslands and lakes. Early humans followed these green corridors, essentially climate-chasing their way into new territories.
The deep history of this movement is only now coming to light. For instance, the discovery of a 400,000-year-old hand axe in the Nefud Desert of Aramea suggests that human ancestors were migrating out of Africa during these favorable climate windows much earlier than previously recognized. These ancient toolmakers were the first to walk the paths that would later be haunted by the failed pioneers of our own species. They proved that the drive to expand was not a modern invention, but a fundamental part of the human story that stretches back nearly 500,000 years. However, these early pioneers were often specialists, adapted to the specific types of environments they were following. When the climate shifted back toward aridity, the green corridors turned back into impassable deserts. The pioneers found themselves trapped in isolated pockets of land, cut off from their home populations in Africa. In the Levant, the modern humans who lived in Skul and Kavze around 100,000 years ago seem to have been replaced by Neanderthals moving south from Europe as the world entered a cold and dry phase. The modern humans simply weren't equipped to handle the environmental shift or the competition from their cold-adapted cousins. For these specialists, the Levant was not a gateway, but a dead-end trap.
The first sign of a permanent shift in this dynamic is found at the Manat 1 fossil site in Israel. Dating to 54,700 years ago, this skull represents the first evidence of Homo sapiens in the Levant after the long period where Neanderthals had pushed them out. Unlike the inhabitants of Skul and Kafsa, the people of Manat 1 were part of a lineage that would endure. They arrived not just as climate chasers, but as a population that had fundamentally changed how it interacted with the world. What changed? For a long time, scientists looked for a silver bullet, a new type of stone tool, or a sudden mutation. Paleoanthropologist Ian Tattersall has explicitly argued that the cultural stimulus for this transformation was likely the invention of language. This breakthrough in symbolic cognition allowed for a level of social coordination and information sharing that was previously impossible. It transformed humans from creatures that reacted to their environment into creatures that could plan for and manipulate it. This cognitive leap manifested as ecological flexibility. As discussed in Chapter 2, the flexibility forged during the African megadroughts became the key to surviving the world beyond the continent. Instead of being specialists who relied on a specific climate, the successful wave of humans became master generalists. They learned to exploit a much broader range of habitats that had previously been barriers. They weren't just following the easy green corridors anymore, they were learning to thrive in high-altitude mountains and dense tropical forests. This ability to pivot survival strategies allowed them to turn the Levant from a trap into a permanent bridge. The timing of this successful wave also places it near the Toba catastrophe. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra erupted, potentially plunging the planet into a volcanic winter. While some argue this event nearly wiped out our species, the archaeological record adds a layer of mystery. In India, stone tools found directly below the volcanic ash suggest that modern humans, or at least very advanced pioneers, were already present in South Asia before the eruption. Whether these specific groups survived the ashfall or were part of the failed waves remains a subject of intense debate. But their presence proves that the drive to expand was constant, even if success was not guaranteed. The route taken by the successful wave was also distinct. While earlier failed migrations often focused on the northern land bridge, the final wave utilized the southern route. This path involved crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow neck of water separating the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. At the time, global sea levels were much lower, making the crossing more manageable. Once they reached the Arabian Peninsula, these humans moved rapidly along the coasts, utilizing a beachcomber strategy that provided a consistent source of marine resources. This southern route dispersal is linked to a specific genetic signature, the mitochondrial haplogroup L3. All non-African people living today carry descendants of this one specific lineage. It is the genetic marker of that final successful wave. The fact that only this one lineage survived to populate the rest of the world suggests a massive bottleneck event. Out of the many diverse populations living in Africa at the time, only a small subset actually made the crossing and became the ancestors of everyone outside of Africa. This group carried with them the ecological flexibility and social complexity that had been perfected over hundreds of thousands of years. As these successful migrants pushed into Eurasia, they encountered the descendants of much earlier migrations, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. While Chapter 3 details the genetic legacy of these encounters, the story of the failed pioneers is one of ecological competition. The archaic groups were the ultimate specialists, having lived in their respective regions for hundreds of thousands of years. But the modern humans arriving from Africa had a hidden advantage in their behavioral plasticity. While Neanderthals often focused on high-quality stone sources and specific types of large game, modern humans were more willing to use whatever material was at hand and to exploit a wider variety of smaller animals and plant foods. They also maintained much larger and more distant social networks. If a local resource failed, a modern human group could rely on connections with distant neighbors for support. The archaic groups, living in smaller, more isolated pockets, were much more vulnerable to the sudden environmental shifts of the late Pleistocene. The success of the final wave wasn't just about replacing the archaic humans. It was about out-surviving them through a generalist strategy that could colonize every available niche, from the Arctic tundra to the rainforest. The mystery of the failed pioneers forces us to reconsider the nature of our success. The stone tools found at Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates, dating to 127,000 years ago, or the Nubian complex tools in Oman from 106,000 years ago, were likely made by these early pioneers. They were modern humans, and they were successful for a time, but they lacked the specific combination of social connectivity and ecological breadth that would allow the final wave to endure. The story of the failed pioneers reminds us that our presence on this planet was not a foregone conclusion. There were many other versions of us that tried to conquer the world and failed. They stood on the same shores and faced the same challenges, but because they remained climate-dependent specialists, they vanished. We are the descendants of the one group that was flexible enough to survive the closing of the windows. This flexibility didn't just allow our ancestors to move outward, it also allowed them to move back, creating a complex two-way flow of people and genes that would eventually blur the very boundaries of the continent they had worked so hard to exit. Chapter 5: The Permeable Membrane and the Braided River of Return. For a long time, the story of human evolution was presented as a one-way departure. We viewed Africa as the starting line of a great race, a place that our ancestors left behind as they moved toward the distant horizons of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In this traditional view, once a group crossed the Red Sea or moved through the Sinai, they were gone from the African story, evolving in isolation until the modern era. However, a wave of new genetic evidence and sophisticated computational modeling is completely dismantling this one-way narrative. We are discovering that the boundaries of Africa were not a wall, but a permeable membrane. Human history was not a single exit, but a constant multi-directional flow of people, genes, and cultures. This realization is giving rise to the Back to Africa model, which shows that Eurasian populations were regularly returning to the continent, reshaping the African gene pool and blurring the lines between who stayed and who left. This shift marks the end of the one-way evolutionary narrative, replacing the linear ladder of the past with a more complex, nonlinear history. The most immediate and striking proof of this narrative of return comes from a genetic time capsule found in the highlands of Ethiopia. In a cool, dry cave known as Mota, researchers discovered a 4,500-year-old skeleton. Because of the unique preservation of the site, scientists were able to sequence Mota's entire genome, providing a snapshot of African genetics just before a massive wave of migration from the Near East reached the Horn of Africa. When researchers compared Mota's DNA to that of people living in the same region today, they found a startling difference. Modern Ethiopians carry significant amounts of West Eurasian ancestry, anywhere from 25 to 50%, which is completely absent in Mota. The Mota genome proved that a massive migration event occurred within the last few millennia, with people from the Near East and Eurasia flowing back into Africa in numbers large enough to reshape the genetics of the entire region. But the impact didn't stop in Ethiopia. Traces of this Eurasian backflow have been detected as far away as the Congo and South Africa, carried by later internal migrations. This shows that the African gene pool has been constantly refreshed and modified by groups returning from the outside world, bringing with them genes that had been evolving in Eurasia for tens of thousands of years, further dispelling the myth of African genetic purity. This bidirectional movement is not a recent phenomenon. It is etched into the deepest branches of our genetic tree. One of the most compelling clues is found in our uniparental DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the male or female line. For years, researchers were puzzled by the relationship between two specific branches of the male Y chromosome tree, haplogroup D and haplogroup E. Haplogroup D is found almost exclusively in isolated populations in Asia, such as in Tibet, Japan, and the Andaman Islands. Its sister branch, haplogroup E, is the most ubiquitous lineage across sub-Saharan Africa. The mystery lies in the fact that these two lineages share a common ancestor that is more recent than their connection to any other group found outside of Africa. The sister relationship between an exclusively Asian lineage and an exclusively African one suggests a complex journey. One highly plausible explanation is that the common ancestor of these two groups actually lived outside of Africa. In this scenario, a population carrying the precursor to these lineages moved into Eurasia, where the D branch was established. Then, a significant portion of that same population migrated back into Africa, carrying the E branch with them. This back-to-Africa pulse would have been massive, eventually spreading haplogroup E across the entire continent until it became the dominant male lineage we see today. This turns the traditional map on its head, suggesting that a major part of the modern African genetic identity was forged by a group returning from the outside. A similar mirror story is emerging from the maternal line. While mitochondrial haplogroup L3 is recognized as the ancestor of all non-African lineages, recent hypotheses propose that its precursor may have actually originated in Asia. In this model, an early group of modern humans exited Africa, developed the specific mutations that define the L3 precursor in the Near East or South Asia, and then migrated back into the African continent. If true, it means that the very genetic foundation of most contemporary African maternal diversity was a gift from a returning population. This permeable membrane worked in both directions, even for archaic populations. We often think of interbreeding as something that happened when modern humans met Neanderthals in Europe, but the flow was more complex. This backflow into archaic populations reinforces the idea that the boundaries between Africa and Eurasia were never truly closed. Modern human genes were moving into Neanderthal populations in Asia at the same time that Eurasian genes were preparing to return to Africa. This bidirectional flow was facilitated by the same climate windows and low sea levels that allowed the first humans to leave, treating the Levant and the Horn of Africa as a single continuous territory. We see the results of these returns most clearly in North Africa. Genetic studies of mitochondrial DNA have identified two specific groups known as U6 and M1. These haplogroups are found across North and East Africa today, but their deepest roots are in the Near East. They represent a major repopulation of North Africa that occurred between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago. As modern humans were expanding across Europe and Asia, some groups were turning back, moving from the Levant into the Nile Valley and across the Mediterranean coast. This return migration was so significant that it largely replaced or heavily mixed with the earlier populations that had stayed in North Africa, creating a genetic profile that is distinct from the rest of the continent. Advanced simulations using neural networks have revealed that the out-of-Africa event itself was likely a series of sequential splits and returns rather than a single clean break. These models suggest that the separation between African and non-African populations happened in at least two stages between 90,000 and 60,000 years ago, separated by 15,000 years of continued interaction. During this time, populations were moving out, but they were also moving back, admixing with the groups that had remained behind. One of the most profound findings of these simulations is that one of the populations resulting from a more recent split actually moved back into Africa and replaced a large portion of the existing West African population. This internal turnover was massive, potentially accounting for up to 90% of the gene pool in contemporary West Africans. This explains why West African populations seem to have a younger separation time from Eurasians than we would expect. It's not because they stayed in place while everyone else moved away. It's because their ancestors were part of a massive back migration that homogenized the continent just as the final expansion into Eurasia was beginning. This internal African turnover changed the source population from which all non-Africans are derived. It means that the people who eventually conquered the world were not a single isolated group that had been sitting in one spot for 100,000 years. They were the product of a continent that was in a state of constant genetic churn. This east-to-west migration within Africa likely brought with it the ecological flexibility and social complexity that had been developing in different regions. When this homogenized population finally expanded into Eurasia, they weren't just bringing African genes, they were bringing a composite genetic and cultural heritage that had been forged through hundreds of thousands of years of internal movement and return. The end of the one-way narrative also changes how we interpret the presence of archaic DNA in African populations. We know that modern humans outside of Africa carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA from encounters in Eurasia. But because of the back-to-Africa migrations, some of that Neanderthal DNA has actually made its way back into the African continent. Modern North Africans and some East African groups carry small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry, often linked to the U6 and M1 haplogroups. They carry these segments not because their ancestors met Neanderthals in Africa, but because their ancestors were Eurasians who returned home. This creates a fascinating genetic loop, where genes that left the continent hundreds of thousands of years ago in the bodies of Neanderthal ancestors eventually returned in the bodies of modern human migrants. This constant exchange also means that the ghost lineages we see in Africa might not have always been African either. Some of these unknown groups could represent very early modern human dispersals that moved into the Near East, picked up unique regional traits, and then were pushed back into Africa by expanding Neanderthals or changing climates. When they returned, they would have looked and acted differently from the populations that had stayed behind, contributing a fresh pulse of genetic and behavioral diversity to the Pan-African mix. The African continent was a reservoir that was constantly being filled and refilled by different streams of humanity. The back to Africa pulses were often driven by the same environmental pressures that shaped our origins. When the northern hemisphere entered intense glacial periods, Eurasia became a much harsher place to live. The relatively stable and diverse environments of Africa would have acted as a powerful magnet, drawing human groups back toward the equator. These returning groups weren't just bringing back genes, they were bringing back new technologies and ways of thinking that had been tested in the challenging environments of the North. This constant injection of new ideas and genetic variants from the outside world likely played a vital role in maintaining the resilience and adaptability of the African populations, reinforcing the generalist strategy that allowed our species to thrive. This revised model portrays the human story as a truly global phenomenon from a much earlier date than we once thought. Instead of a series of isolated developments on different continents, we see a single vast interconnected population that spanned Africa and Western Eurasia. The boundaries we draw between African and Eurasian are largely modern constructs that don't reflect the fluid reality of the Pleistocene. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa were part of a single geographic arena where humans moved freely in response to the rhythm of the ice ages. The realization that evolution was a two-way street also helps us understand the muddle of the fossil record in a new light. When we see fossils in Africa that show a sudden appearance of new traits, we don't necessarily have to assume they evolved in situ. They could be the result of a return migration bringing those traits from a different part of the interconnected network. Similarly, the failed pioneers who moved into Eurasia might not have all died out. Some of them likely moved back, bringing their experiences and adaptations back into the African fold. This makes the search for a single origin point for any specific human trait almost impossible, as traits were likely being shared and traded across vast distances for millennia. The genetic homogenization of Africa, driven by these internal and external returns, created a species that was remarkably uniform in its core biology but incredibly diverse in its regional expressions. By the time the final, successful expansion into the rest of the world occurred, the human population was like a highly pressurized vessel of genetic and cultural innovation. The Back to Africa movements had ensured that the most successful adaptations from across the Old World were concentrated and recombined within the African reservoir. This made the final wave of migrants not just a random group of survivors, but a distilled essence of the most successful human strategies from across the entire interconnected network. The evidence for these return migrations is still being mapped, but its impact on the out-of-Africa model is already permanent. We can no longer view our history as a simple departure from a static home. We have to see it as a story of a species that was always on the move, always exploring, and frequently returning. This bidirectional flow created a human family that is deeply and anciently connected, tied together by a web of migrations that ignored the boundaries of continents. The one-way evolutionary narrative has been replaced by the vision of a global braided river of humanity. The geological and environmental forces of the African continent continued to play a central role in this story, not just as a cradle or a destination, but as a dynamic stage where the very ground was shifting beneath the feet of our ancestors. As the Earth itself moved, it created the final set of barriers and bridges that would define the modern map of our species.
In summary, the traditional out-of-Africa model has been profoundly revised. Our story is no longer a simple linear exodus from a single cradle. Instead, we are the product of a deep, interconnected history, a braided river of ancient populations across Africa and Eurasia. We evolved as a mosaic species, shaped by climate shifts, repeated migrations, and genetic mixing with other human lineages. This new narrative reveals a world where boundaries between groups were porous, and our success stems from being master generalists. Ultimately, these revisions remind us that our origins are gloriously complex and shared. Thank you for listening.